I bought a Rudsted display cabinet from IKEA to defend my models from dust and cat hair, and it came with these cardboard protective chunks instead of styrofoam. Very eco-friendly, but I was kind of counting on more raw material for terrain. But I decided to keep them anyways, thinking maybe they'd come in useful. Well, today's the day. I recently watched the new Dune movie, and when I saw the Navigator's spice silos, I looked at the beer can in my hand and was touched with sudden inspiration. The cans aren't quite as squat as the ones in the movie, but this is going to be an inspired by, rather than an attempt to accurately and faithfully recreate them. Plus, dude, this is my third attempt at terrain. Trying to properly mimic terrain from a massive Hollywood sci-fi epic blockbuster created by the best in the field, that might be setting my sights just a little too high. After all, I'm not Percy.
I see. And the fact that this secret has eluded the most intelligent people since the dawn of time doesn't dampen your spirits.
Oh no, I like a challenge.
In the architect firm I used to work at, the large format printers had these whopper rolls of paper that came on dense cardboard tubes. I snagged them whenever they appeared in the recycling bin because drill a few air holes along the side, stuff them with crumpled paper, and they made the best fire starters when camping. Pile the wood on top and they are guaranteed to get the fires raging in moments. I cut a cardboard strip to use as a measuring device to ensure everything came out the same width. I wrapped it around, marked it with some guidelines, and used a bread knife to try and cut it off. On the table, I just couldn't lean into it hard enough, so I transferred to the floor and began sawing away. The next day, my triceps were raging. I guess this isn't a move I make in the gym or when climbing. In retrospect, I would have liked to have used a chop saw for a much more even cut, but I didn't have one since mine was stolen by thieving bastards who raided my shed. The timing was extra annoying because once I finished this project, a mate said she had a bunch of styrofoam that I might want to pick up and play with. When I went over there, oh look, it was packing for a brand new chop saw.
Extremely bad timing.
Anyways, I used an X-Acto knife to clean up the ragged edges as much as I could, and when the X-Acto wasn't up for the task, I switched to a utility blade, and then used a simple nail file to smooth out the edges as much as I could. Then, on to the actual base. I took a large section, wide enough to accommodate the beer cans, I measured out the areas I wanted to use, and then used a compass with a blade to etch out some nice perfect circles. The blade isn't particularly sharp, so I needed to use my X-Acto knife to finish the job with some gentle sawing motions. I tried to just lift the cardboard off, but the interior paper honeycomb had a rather firm grip on it, so I stabbed something into the disc and popped out the circle of card and then ripped out the internal cardboard. I made this around Halloween, so it felt like emptying out a pumpkin, but a desiccated one. An Arrakis pumpkin. The beer can fits perfectly. I just don't know whether to place them upside down or not. We'll see. Knowing that it fits nicely, I used the compass to cut out the next two circles. I placed the exposed end of the platform on some more cardboard and marked it out to get a panel so I could seal the exposed ends and hide the honeycomb interior. I then did the same for the other end to create a sealed box. Next, I cut out a series of foam core squares to act as support struts. I placed them on the base, dropped the hoops onto them, and moved on to creating a curb on either end of the main base to run between the two raised side blocks. A couple of strips of foam core with thin strips of cardboard glued across the top to hide the interiors, and I dropped the compass box onto them to keep them pinned in place to dry. Then, I had a different idea for the supports. I cut out a longer strip of foam core and laid the cardboard hoops onto it, allowing me to mark the height of the disc on one end of the foam core. Gently laying my X-Acto knife to it, I cut through the paper and then through the foam beneath, before gently sawing in from the top to remove everything except the single paper panel. So now I can add the support struts and there is a nice piece running up the exterior of the hoops. I also wanted to make sure I placed these on the more obvious spiral grooves to conceal them as much as I could. Now you know your knife is getting dull when it is too blunt to help you open the package where your new X-Acto replacement blades are located.
May your blade chip and shatter.
Now, onto the sides, where I wanted to create slots where loading equipment can slide in so the pallet can be lifted and shipped. I placed the piece of packing I wanted to use next to the base so I could decide roughly how high I wanted it to be. I marked off the height I liked, cut them to size, put them in place and inserted the beer cans so I can take a look at how the whole thing might appear. Okay, coming along nicely. I grabbed my compass, opened it out just a little more from the diameter I used for the beer can slots and cut out circles in the foam core. Again, I used an X-Acto knife to help cut them free because the blade is getting pretty dull. I then cut another thin strip of cardboard to place around the exterior of the discs and hide the foam interior. I took a piece of chipboard and cut along the edges at an angle to create a nice bevel. Working with several light strokes ensured the blade didn't wobble and mess up the cut. I kept the same angle on the other side, trimmed it to size, and then glued my panels into position at either end of the main base. I left the block on its side and dropped a weight on it to make sure they glue nice and tight. As you can see, I did not like the thin pieces at the sides because it might make figures unstable, so I decided on a thicker piece to make it much more stout, and then cut some more cardboard squares to lock in the insides. I cut more cardboard to be the upper surface of the side blocks and glued two pieces into place because my cardboard isn't long enough to do the job in one go. I'm hoping what I use for the texture will conceal this seam. I then placed a square piece of the packing on top, added some big candles as weights to keep it in position and left it to dry. I changed my mind with regard to the foam discs and added a cardboard rim that was a bit deeper, glued it into position and applied an elastic band to hold it there to dry and let me get on with other things. Now this thing on the Dune silos looked nifty, so I wanted to add something similar. For these upper panels I cut some cardboard, pressed it against a pen to help curve it and then glued it into position. I tried cutting out some more cardboard discs to place on top, but they were a little too thin, so I tried it with chipboard, but my compass just wasn't sharp enough to do the job cleanly. I really wanted something to represent a hatch or a port where the contents can be pumped or poured in. The discs were just too ragged, but then I had the idea of taking the pop top from spice bottles to create a nice cap for the silos. I like to cook and experiment with new dishes and have many weird cookbooks, and sometimes I accidentally rebuy a spice I already have or open and use a new one before finishing the old. So by condensing down some of my supplies, I found 3 empty bottles, cut the caps off and trimmed away the excess plastic to get a cool, perfect circle. Spice silos with spice bottle caps on top. Perfection.
The spice must flow.
I glued everything into position and added the sides and applied the 3 long beveled chipboard strips to the upper surface to create raised panels, and the same on the ends of the side supports. I had forgotten I intended them to be on the side and not the top because these were going to be the hatches, forklifts or other lifting equipment to insert and haul the pallet away. But in the end, turns out this worked out much better.
Perhaps your incompetence will prove useful after all.
I glued the sides into position and placed some candles on top to press it down while they dried. Sandpaper in the beer cans gave them a rougher surface for the primer to grip to, and on a typical sunny Seattle day, I placed my cans in my shoebox and gave them a nice thick coat of matte primer. First, I cut out longer rectangles from the chipboard and gave them the beveled angle, the same width as the support struts. I glued them along the struts, so this is an additional point of attachment that clamps to the silo once it's ready to go, much like in the inspirational image. I put the cans in position to make sure they fit, and all looked grand. The mate who got the chop saw has been decorating eggs and had Mod Podge left over and asked if I wanted it. Okay, the timing for the chop saw sucked, but this timing was perfect because there was a third technique I wanted to try for creating texture, and this was it. I added a squirt of white acrylic and a squirt of black acrylic, stirred it up, and with my big fat brush started painting it into place and dabbing to create a nice stipple effect. Not as drastic as the bunkers, not as rough as the choke station, but because this is a more recently created item, it won't look as old and weathered, so perfect. I had dabbed it all over and then coated the support rings and struts, getting it pretty much everywhere else at this point as well. Those sides look a little blank. Now this is when I started to realise I had glued the chipboard rectangles that were on top in the wrong place.
Oh, you idiots!
First off, I painted the cans and stippled on top and used even brush strokes down the sides so that the top looks more rough than the sides of the silos. So now that I realised I had nothing on the sides, I cut out 4 strips. I didn't think I would be able to create the slots that are visible on the Dune versions, and so I'd hoped to use the long rectangles to represent hatches that protected the slots so that sand and other material didn't get in. But seeing as I had accidentally glued them in the wrong position, I suddenly had the idea of cutting out a chipboard rectangle and cutting an angled hole in the middle, and then maybe just painting that bit darker to give the impression that there is an opening. I painted them with Mod Podge and glued them in position. I placed it on its side and dropped the leftover chipboard on top and grabbed the big candles I have in readiness for the frequent power outages I get over the winter so that I have light. These chunky boys pinned them in position so I could let everything dry. I used the glue gun to put the support bands in place, added more hot glue to secure the cans in position, and applied a light dry brush of army painter mithril silver to the silos, especially around the edges of the hatch and the perimeter. With the silver applied, I made a lighter grey Mod Podge mixture and started to dry brush the main shipping pallet. I lightened the Mod Podge mixture even more and applied a more frugal dry brush before lightening to near almost white and adding a few more touches, and then I made a watered down black wash for the insert slots on the sides, and then I applied a final very white dry brush at the outermost edges. At this stage I have finished my own interpretation of the Dune spice silos, but this isn't for Dune, it is for Warhammer 40,000. Now there are navigators in the Imperium as well, but they do not rely on spice.
He who controls the spice controls the universe.
Also, they are noble houses, so if this is a shipping silo pallet that does belong to the Navis Nobilite, then I'm sure there will be heraldry to declare that. When someone has a coat of arms, they do like to plaster it on everything. I tried cutting out the emblem of the navigators as a stencil. I spent ages on the laurels before realising it was too big to even fit on the cans. Well, that was a wasted half an hour. So I cut out the 3 diamonds to give me a rough outline and then used a fine brush to finish creating the navigator's emblem. And as you can see, I put it on upside down. Hey, I'm not that familiar with the navigators, and also, it looks more like graffiti than heraldry at this point, so I decided I would paint over it and would create small cardboard printed squares with the proper emblem on it to represent metal plates bolted to the side of the silos to declare ownership. I made the emblem in Illustrator, and while I was preparing it, I decided to also print 3 biohazard symbols, which I will cut out as a circle so I can slap them onto the spice caps that are the hatches for the top of the silos, thereby warning people of the nasty grimdark goo that lies within. I bent the navigator plates over a pen to pre-carve them and ran a red pen on their edges to hide the exposed white core. On the raised panel that I'd seen on the Dune silos, I used a stencil to label and number the silos. I was going to use Roman numerals, but I've done that twice on my previous projects, so I figured the navigators are happier with actual numbers. I glued the cardboard printed navigator emblem into position, and I added a little more silver dry brushing to diffuse the black I'd applied to hide my feeble upside down emblem doodle. Now, one aspect of the choke station I lasted was the hazard striping. It's good, but I can see what went squiffy. So to prove to myself I can do it better, and that I can actually do it decently, I'm going to add it to the bands. First, a slightly watered down black applied around the edge. Then I placed blue tape on my cutting board, measured out 1 centimeter increments and used a knife to cut them into strips, and then peeled these little sections away. Using a drafting triangle to ensure the angle remained consistent, I applied the stripes around the upper band. Once they were in place, I used Flash Gits Yellow, and having learned from my previous attempt, I used vertical up and down motions to paint them, because left to right causes the paint to bleed under the tape even more than it already does. It took 2 or 3 coats, but then once it was dry, I could peel it away to reveal nice even stripes that I touched up a few areas with black and yellow to erase some bleeds, and yes, much better. Lastly, a quick layer of black on some diamond dots, and then a quick dry brush of mithril silver, and using tweezers I dabbed them in Elmer's and glued them into place around the cardboard navigator heraldry plate to serve as bolts holding them in place. And here's the finished item, an Imperial Navigator shipping pallet. It can hold up to 3 generic shipping silos of crops, raw materials, liquids, whatever needs transportation. In this case, it is 3 containers of biohazardous waste, ready to be sent for disposal far from any inhabited world. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more experimental nonsense.